was a time when calling someone a pianist could almost be an insult. Not because the piano was unimportant, quite the opposite. The 19th century was full of pianists, brilliant pianists, dazzling pianists, pianists who could cover the keyboard in octaves, scales, arpeggios, tremolos, thunder, lightning, and occasionally, one suspects, minor structural damage. But in 1874, when Oscar Comettant wrote about the French pianist Francis Planté, he began with a very different word. A man, writing to Planté, had addressed him not as "my dear pianist," but as "my dear poet." Comettant loved this. To call Planté merely a pianist, he says, would almost have been impertinent. After all, who is not a pianist? I am, you are, he is, we are, you are, they are all pianists. But a poet, that is different. This is The Musical Archaeologist, Forgotten Ideas from Music's Past. I'm Craig Dabelstein, and today we are looking at a small book by Oscar Comettant called Francis Planté, Portrait musical à la plume, a musical portrait in words, published in Paris in 1874. Comettant is one of those 19th century musical figures who deserves to be better remembered. He was a composer, pianist, critic, traveller, and musicologist. A writer of enormous energy and curiosity, though today he tends to live somewhat in the shadow of figures like Jean-Georges Castner, whose musicological work was larger, more systematic, and more often remembered. Francis Planté, the subject of Comettant's little book, was once one of the most admired pianists in France. He had heard Chopin himself, knew the world of Liszt, Thalberg, Berlioz, and Rubinstein, and became famous in a culture where a great performance could become legendary without being easily preserved. That is one of the strange cruelties of music history. A painting remains, a book remains, a building remains, but a performance disappears as soon as the last sound has faded. Planté's reputation was enormous, but most of what made him extraordinary vanished into the ears and memories of people long dead. And so we are left with words, Comettant's words. And the idea he gives us is this. Perhaps the highest praise we can give a performer is not that they are accurate or impressive or brilliant or even virtuosic. Perhaps the highest praise is that they are poetic. Now that word can sound vague today. We often use poetic to mean something dreamy, decorative, or pleasantly unclear. But Comettant means something much stronger. For him, the poet is not merely a writer of verses. A poet may write prose, but may paint in oils, play an instrument, or knead clay. What matters is not the medium. What matters is the power to give a soul to matter. That phrase is worth pausing over. To give a soul to matter. A pianist, in the ordinary sense, presses keys. The mechanism of the instrument does the rest. Hammers strike strings, the air vibrates, sound comes out. But for Comettant, that is not enough. A true artist does not simply activate a machine. He spiritualizes it. He makes matter speak. This is why Planté matters to him. Planté had everything that could impress an audience. Critics praised his power, clarity, agility, command of octaves, control of the pedals, and astonishing delicacy of sound. But Comettant is careful not to confuse these things with artistry itself. Technique, in his view, is not the goal. It is the condition that allows the real work to begin. Comettant says that Planté did not have to concern himself with the purely mechanical part of playing. That had already been mastered. Because of this, he could abandon himself entirely to the poetic interpretation of the work. That's a beautiful and rather dangerous idea. Dangerous because it suggests that correctness is not enough. A performance may be accurate and still be empty. It may be clean and still say nothing. It may contain every note, every rhythm, every printed dynamic, every carefully observed articulation, and yet somehow fail to become music in the fullest sense. We all know this, I think, though we may be reluctant to say it. There are performances that are spotless and dead. And there are performances that may contain small imperfections but seem to breathe, speak, suffer, rejoice, remember, and hope. Comettant would have understood the difference. For him, Planté was not great because he triumphed over difficulty. He was great because he remained musical in the midst of difficulty. Where others might triumph in the note, Planté remained master of the mechanism and free in expression. That's a very fine distinction. To triumph in the note is to win the little battle. To remain musical is to win the larger one. And perhaps this is one of the forgotten problems in musical education. We spend an enormous amount of time helping students win the little battles. Play the correct pitch, keep the rhythm steady, observe the marking, do not rush, do not drag, tune the chord, watch the conductor, count the rests. All of that matters, but it is not the destination. A musician can play every note and still leave the heart untouched. Comettant's praise of Planté reminds us that the purpose of technique is not to prove that technique exists. The purpose of technique is to disappear into meaning. That applies far beyond the piano. A wind player must do more than produce a good tone. A singer must do more than support the breath. A conductor must do more than keep time. A band must do more than play together. All of these things are necessary, but none of them is the final destination. The real question is always, what is being said? Comettant describes Planté as having the secret of hearts. That's a wonderfully 19th century phrase, but I think we still know what it means. There are performers who seem to know where the emotional centre of a piece lies. They do not bully the music. They do not decorate it with borrowed feeling. They listen inwardly until they discover what the music is asking to become, and then they lead us there. When Comettant called Francis Planté a poet, he was not giving him a decorative compliment. He was naming the central mystery of performance. That wood, wire, ivory, felt, breath, brass, gut, skin, and human muscle can become something inward, something that passes through the ear and into the heart. That is the old idea worth recovering. A performer is not merely someone who plays. A performer is someone who makes music human. And if that is true, then perhaps the real task of musical training is not only to produce better pianists, better clarinetists, better trumpet players, better singers, and better conductors. It is to produce more poets. Poets of sound. You've been listening to The Musical Archaeologist, Forgotten Ideas from Music's Past. Written and presented by me, Craig Dabelstein. The music for this podcast was composed by Jeffrey Young. The Musical Archaeologist is one of many projects from Maxime's Music, dedicated to recovering forgotten music, forgotten writings, and forgotten musical worlds. Thank you for listening.